For the next few weeks, instead of studying vocabulary words, we're going to be studying our benchmark fractions, decimals, and percents. This is something that we took several quizzes on last fall in the first and second 6 weeks. This is a number that we should know automatically as being 1/2, and there is an equivalent decimal and an equivalent percent that we should know immediately without any calculation. However, if you did have to calculate it, this fraction means that one thing has been cut into two pieces. So we're going to take the number 1 and divide it by the number 2 in order to figure out what this is. So what is 1 divided by 2? What is 1/2 as a decimal? Answer that, please. And what would 1/2 of 100% be? Answer that, please. Okay, so as we study these flashcards, all we have to do is click on it, and 1/2 is the same as 50 hundredths. That could also be read as 50 cents. If we ignore the 0, it's also 1/2 is equivalent to 5/10. And of course, 1/2 of 100% is 50%. Now, if we have one thing divided into 4 pieces, think about what that decimal equivalent would be. Now, here's a hint. If you cut something into halves and then you cut it a second time, it's going to be in 4 pieces. So here we have 1/2. If I cut it again, it's going to be in 4 pieces. So the decimal equivalent will be half of a half. So think about what 1/2 as a decimal is and cut that in half. And then the same thing will be true for the percent. Answer that for me, please. Very good. That's going to be 25 hundredths, which is half of 50, and 25%, which is half of 50%. 3/4. Okay, so we just found out what 1/4 is. If we had 3 of them, how much would that be as a decimal? Answer that, please. Remember that 1/4 was 25 hundredths. So what is 3/4 going to be? 75 hundredths. 25 plus 25 plus 25, and that is equivalent to 75%. 25, 25, 25. Okay. What about 1/8? Okay, so if we go back to thinking about 1/2 as being 50 hundredths. So here's 1/2. And then if we had 1/4, that was 25 hundredths. 25, 25, 25, 25 is 100. But if we have 8s, if we cut fourths again, then that's 8 pieces. So if this piece here is 25, what would half of 25 be? That would be equivalent to 1/8, half of 25. Answer that for me, please. Well, half of 25 is 12 5/10. That would be written as a decimal as 125 thousandths. And when we multiply that by 100, we get the percent, which is 12 5/10%. What about 1/3? This is something that's supposed to be a benchmark fraction. Again, if you don't have this memorized, you need to stop and divide the number 1 by the number 3. Go ahead and do that for me, please. That is going to be 0.3333 repeating, and when we multiply that by 100, it's 33 3/10%. That's something we need to memorize. 5, 1/5. So if we think about one thing cut into 5 pieces, what number times 5 is equivalent to 1/100th, and how does that help us figure out what 1/5 is? Go ahead and divide 1 by the number 5 if you don't know what the decimal will be for this. That is going to be 20 hundredths, and that's the same as 20%. 5 times 20 is 100, so that's where that comes from. 1/6. One thing divided into 6 pieces. Now also remember, we know what 1/3 is. That is 33 hundredths repeating. What would half of that be? That would be equivalent to 1/6. So what is half of 33 repeating going to be? 16 and 66% repeating. Again, this is something we need to memorize if you haven't already done so. What about 1/10? This should be super easy. What is one whole dollar divided into 10 pieces going to be? What coin, if you had 10 of them, would be equivalent to $1? Go ahead and answer that, please. That would be 10 cents, which is equivalent to a dime, which is 10% of $1. 3/8. So going back to what an eighth is, 20. So we have 125 hundredths. What would 3 of these be? Think about that. You can also divide the number 3 by 8 to figure this out, but then you need to memorize it. 37 and 5/10%, or 375 thousandths, is going to be equivalent to 3/8. 2/5. Just a moment ago, we found out what 1/5 was. What would 2/5 be? Answer that, please. 40 hundredths or 40%. Very good. 5/8 as a decimal will be what? 62. 625 thousandths, or 62 and 5/10%. What about 4/10? How much would that be? 40 hundredths or 40%. What about 3/10? How much is that going to be? If 1/10 was 10%, or 10 hundredths, how much would 3 be? 30 hundredths or 30%. What about 2/3? We know what 1/3 is. How much would 2 of those be? 66 hundredths repeating, or 66 and 67% if we round that repeating decimal. What about 5/10? We've talked about that earlier. If we have the number 5 divided by 10, what's that equivalent to? That is the same as 5/10, or 50%. It's also equivalent to 1/2. What about 3/5? We discovered what 1/5 was by dividing number 1 by 5. What would happen if you had 3 of those? What would that be? 6/10, or 60 hundredths, or 60%. What about 4/4? If we have the number 4 and divide it by 4, what is that going to be equivalent to? That's equivalent to 1, and it's also equivalent to 100%. Anything that has the numerator and the denominator as the same number is going to be 100%. Nothing's been taken from this fraction. It's equivalent to 1 whole. What about 4/5? If you divide the number 4 by 5, or if you think 1/5, and I've got 4 of them, how much would that be? 8/10, or 80 hundredths, or 80%. What about 7/8? 7 divided by 8, 1/8 added together 7 times. What would that be? 875 thousandths, or 87 and 5/10%. Please memorize these benchmark fractions. And finally, what would 9/10 be? 1/10 9 times. 9 divided by the number 10. That would be 9/10, or it would be 90 hundredths, or it could be 90%. Okay, so take some time each day and study these. There will be several benchmark fractions, decimals, and percents quizzes before we take the STAR test and before the end of the year. These are things that you need to have memorized. All right, so every single day starting on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and beyond, we're going to have flashcards to study these percents, decimals, and fractions, so take some time to do that each day.